In this video, we have a look at the multi-resolution, or in short, multi-res modifier workflow. In a nutshell, using the multi-res modifier is a non-destructive way of sculpting in Blender. Similar as the subsurf modifier, it is subdividing the mesh into a higher resolution, and then we can sculpt directly on these subdivisions. We can easily change between and sculpt on different subdivision levels without changing anything on the original mesh. Same as for the previous workflow videos. Here we will only have a look at the most important settings while sculpting a pier. Well, a living pier with a butt. Again, you can find a detailed description of all the important settings of this modifier in the sculpting settings section at the end of the course. And also the pros and cons of it will be described in a separate video when we're comparing the different sculpting workflows. So here I am back in the default sculpting preset. However, we don't want to sculpt on this sphere here. Let's click on this plus here and add the layout workspace. Let's get rid of the camera and the lamp here, we don't need that. And let's also get rid of this sphere here. We want to add another sphere. However, I don't want to add a UV sphere, for example, because let's add this here for a second and add the subsurf modifier and increase the subdivisions here a bit. You can see that up here we get this rippling effect, and when I enable wireframe, we can see that it's disable optimal display, then we can see each and every face here. Up here we have a higher resolution than on the sides here, for example. And for sculpting, especially with the multi-resolution modifier, it's best to have a relatively even distributed topology, and it's even better when only using quads. So, however, we can create another sphere. For that, let's go to Edit and Preferences, or simply press F4 and then click on Preferences. It's a bit faster. Then go to Add-ons, and up here, search for Extra and then enable Add Mesh Extra Objects. Now, if I hit Shift A, go to Mesh, you can see down here we have a bunch of new basic objects which we can add, and we also have this round cube. Let's add this one here. However, this is still not what I want. Down here in the operator panel, let's go to the operator presets and change this to quad sphere. Then with the arc, let's decrease the subdivisions to 4. And yeah, this is something which we can work with. Up here, let's disable the wireframe. And now let's go over to edit mode and press 3 on your keyboard for the face selection. Let's press Alt A to deselect everything and then simply draw a box around these faces here. From the side view, let's press E and extrude it up a little bit. Press S to scale it down, and with Ctrl R, let's add a loop cut over here. To disable this sliding, press Escape, and let's increase the number of cuts to 2. I think that should work. Maybe let's scale it in a little bit. Then let's select these faces up here. Press 3 again to have the face selection. Press Shift D, so we duplicate them. Press Escape, then it's jumping back, but it's still duplicated here. Then let's press P to open up the separate menu and then click on selection to separate the selection. And then you can see up here, it's a separate object. Now when I'm back in object mode, you can see we have 2 objects. This one here, let's quickly select these 4 outer vertices and press S for scaling to shape this more like a circle. Press Alt Z to enable X-ray. Scale it down a little bit and extrude it up with E. Scale it up here a bit. Maybe all together scale it down a bit more. Move it down. And let's also add 2 cuts here. So both objects, this one here, the stem, and this one down here has a relatively even distributed topology. Let's disable X-ray. And of course, this should become a pier. So let's start with the base here. You probably know the subdivision surface modifier or the subsurf modifier. Let's go to the modifier tab and add this one here. And let's increase the resolution here. And as you can see, we are adding more subdivisions to the object. However, let's enable wireframe up here. And you can see we have this grid on the surface here. Since optimal display is enabled, we can only see the grid from the original base geometry we have here. And when I now would switch over to sculpt mode and for example, use the grab brush, we can see that this little yellow dot here is only snapping to the base geometry. That means I can only change the base geometry and I can't change something in between here, like adding tiny details. However, let's go back to object mode. Let's remove the subsurf modifier and now let's add the multi-resolution modifier instead. you can see it looks a bit different. We have these levels up here. However, I can't just increase the levels or decrease them here. What we have to do first is to click on the subdivide button. Let's subdivide this a few times, maybe 3 times for now. And we can still see the grid of the base geometry on the surface. However, if I now switch over to sculpting, you can see it's snapping to each vertex which the multires modifier generates. So if I draw on the surface here, we are actually changing the geometry which the multires modifier generates. So to learn a bit more about the multires modifier, let's just start sculpting here on the surface. First of all, let's disable the wireframe and let's enable X symmetry, and let's switch over to the sculpting workspace for a bit cleaner UI. First of all, you can see that whenever I move around, the resolution is changing to a lower resolution. This is an option we can find up here under options, which is called fast navigate. We can also find it down here in the sculpting settings under options. And this turns the mesh into a low resolution version while we are navigating around this to speed up the navigation process. That means if you have a very high resolution object, this can help. However, since we are working on a relative simple object, let's disable this here. And this option only works for the multi-resolution modifier, so it will not work with dynamic topology, for example. So symmetry is on. Let's start with the grab brush. And first of all, let's shape this a bit organically because we don't want to have like a boring looking pier. Let's shape it a bit like this. Down here, let's put it a bit to the inside, something like this. And maybe with the clay strips brush, let's remove some of the geometry over here. And you can see now everything I'm doing, I'm using the actual geometry which the multires modifier added to the object. Let's smooth this out a little bit. And of course, it wouldn't be me if we wouldn't add a face to this thing. So let's add with a blob brush, a blob over here and a second blob over here. Smooth this a bit. Let's also add 2 blobs here on the side. This will be the nose. Let's add an inverted blob in here to add the nostrils. And let's add an inverted blob over here, which is this little line above the lips. And then carefully, let's also add some geometry here and some geometry over here. Smooth this a bit. And before we continue sculpting here, we changed the geometry quite a bit. However, we now can change the levels up here. You can see we have the level viewport, sculpt, and render. Viewport is for object mode. Render is, of course, if we would later on render this image, and sculpt is for sculpt mode. Let's decrease this and let's get back to 0, and you can see that we still have our perfect base mesh and nothing was deformed. That means using a multires modifier is all in all a relative non-destructive workflow for sculpting. We will use an option later on which will deform the base geometry a bit. However, we could just go on sculpting as we just did without changing anything here on the base geometry. However, if I now increase the resolution here, you can see how this is changing not only the resolution, but we can then again also see the details. And the cool thing is, since right now the resolution is not enough in order to add more details, we can always subdivide this even higher. So when you click on subdivide, now you can see we have 4 levels of subdivision. Now let's use the draw sharp brush and draw a line somewhere here, which should become the mouse. Let's also add a line over here because this pier should look friendly. And let's add a bit of clay strips over here and smooth them out for the cheeks. Let's also smooth this one here a bit and this one. And let's also use the draw sharp brush to add lines for the eyes. And I want to have closed eyes here, so it should be a relaxed, friendly pier. Let's also increase the nostrils a bit and add a line around here and maybe one line down here, something like this. And the cool thing is with the multires modifier, I now could go in here and, for example, go down with the resolution, because sometimes when you have a very high resolution and you already sculpted tiny details, you don't want to lose them, but you maybe want to do some bigger changes. And now let's, for example, use a grab brush, and we could now do a drastic change here. I don't know, something like this, for example. And now when I go up with the resolution once again, you can see we still have all the details here, but the major shape has changed. And this, for example, is not really that easy possible when using dynamic topology or the remeshing workflow when you already have a lot of details. However, of course, we don't want to have this weird looking pier, so let's put this back once again. And you can see when I now change it back and increase the resolution, it looks pretty good. So now let's add a little bit of a hole up here where we can put the stamp. And yeah, it wouldn't be me if we wouldn't add a butt to this pier here. So let's add a little butt here just for fun. And I think piers do have butts. So something like this. Now let's get over to the stem before we finish up the face here. Let's pick this up and let's go over to layout. The origin is down here, which makes it a bit hard to rotate. So let's right click, go to set origin and click on origin to geometry. Then it jumps up here. Let's go to the right view, rotate it a bit and put it somewhere here. And here let's also use the multires modifier and subdivide this. Let's say 2 times. I think this is enough. Let's go over to sculpting here. And in this case, I don't have symmetry on. Let's use a grab brush and move it around a little bit. Should look a little bit organic. With a draw sharp brush, let's add a little hole in here. Something like this. Pretty simple. Then let's go back to the face here and let's add another level of subdivision and clean up the face a bit by adding some tiny details here. So sharpen the lines a bit. And one thing you can see right out of the bat compared to the previous 2 workflows, that working with a multires modifier adds a much smoother geometry. Let's add some more lines around here. Smooth this edge a bit. Yeah, I think that does look how I want it. Maybe let's add a bit more flesh over here. So yeah, this looks nice. So similar as for the other workflows we have seen here, in the sculpting settings section at the end of the course, I will also go over all the settings here and explain each and every detail. But the most important settings we have here are this subdivide and the levels up here. And under shape, we have the apply base. That means right now, when I go back to level 0, you can see this is still our base geometry, but sometimes it can happen that the base geometry differs quite a lot from what you have sculpted. So if I switch over here, you can see how this is changing quite a bit. And this might become a problem later on when you want to animate this object or deform it while animating or something like this, or even texture painting. This can become a problem because the final shape is quite different from the original shape. By the way, using the multires modifier for animation and so on is pretty cool because you have a low resolution object which you can animate, and then later on in the final animation you have the very high details. This is much easier to do with a multires modifier than, for example, having an object with millions of polygons which you sculpted with dynamic topology. Anyway, now I can simply click on apply base and then the overall shape of my sculpting here will be applied to the base geometry here. You can see we have this little butt here and the nose. Of course, it just uses the base geometry, what it has. It will not add any geometry. It's just deforming the base mesh. And now the lowest version and the highest version share at least some major details. So when you switch over to object mode and the resolution is changing, then simply change the viewport levels up here to get the high resolution. Also, when you have a lot of objects in your scene and some of them are sculpted with the multires modifier, it can be quite useful to lower the resolution for the viewport when you're not working on the object, but keep the resolution for the render at maximum. Then let's right click, shade smooth, same for the thing up here, shade smooth. And you can see, as mentioned before, that the shape looks much smoother when using the multires modifier. Now, as one last thing, I want to show you a cool feature this multires modifier has. Let's imagine you have imported an object into Blender which was created in a different software. There they also had something like a subsurf modifier, but this was applied. So let's hover our mouse above the multires modifier and hit Ctrl A to apply it. That means this shape was now applied on the mesh. That means in edit mode you can see we can edit everything what the multires modifier created. So we of course also lose all the layers. Or do we? let's re-add the multires modifier. And of course, we don't have any layers by default. We could subdivide it, but then we just add more geometry to the mesh. However, it also has this nice unsubdivide feature. That means if I click on that once, it will basically create one layer for us. If I click on this once again, and again, and again, and again, it basically created 5 layers for us, which we now can use for sculpting directly in Blender. So you can basically break up a subdivided object back into different layers. Of course, these are not the same layers which we had before, because it can only work with the highest details it has and then break them down into lower versions. But now I could go in here and sculpt something on the low version to add some major details, and then we still have all the details here. So I think this can in some cases be really useful. Yeah. Now you have a basic idea on how to sculpt something with the multi-resolution modifier. We already learned about some of the pros and cons. However, in the next video, we will have a look on what are the pros and the cons of these different workflows and when to use which workflow.